Okay, the 2024 HR benchmark report is in, and we're a little over halfway through our series. I invite you to follow along, hop on the website, asuresoftware.com, go to ebook and resources, download the ebook and follow along if you would. Um, uh, we asked 1,065 people who responded to our survey. We asked them 5 questions in each of 8 areas from pre-employment through post-employment. Here's the sections: recruiting and hiring, benefits, onboarding, development, compliance, retention, performance, and post-employment. So we're a little over halfway. We're going to focus on compliance, and we're going to unpack the 5 questions we asked in compliance. Now, 5 questions times those 8 sections, that's 40 questions. We asked one final question at the end of the survey. What best describes you last year? Was it a fast growth year? Was it a growth year? Or was it a zero growth year? Were you down, or were you flat year over year? And then we correlate the results of how they say yes or no to these HR best practices, and how does that correlate to revenue growth? Here's the thing on compliance. So some of these topics, I think it's intuitive. Like if you are better at finding talented people, if you're better at developing talented people, if you're better at retaining talented people, in building a culture of success, it seems obvious how that could correlate to revenue growth. I think it's not intuitive how following the laws, aka compliance, correlates to revenue growth. But spoiler alert, it's a big correlation. It's a correlation for our entire sample size, all 1,065 respondents. But when I slice the data to the smaller firms under 25 employees, it really gets big. And it's clear that the small firms, they don't have the bandwidth and the resources, so they struggle. And in my opinion, I think they don't know what they don't know. They're so busy just trying to run their business every day. They probably don't know what they don't know around compliance. But interestingly, when I look at the bigger companies versus the smaller companies, the fast growth firms don't drop a whole lot. The zero growth firms drop by a whole bunch, meaning even the smallest firms, they get the importance of compliance, not just for following the law, but for building a culture of trust and respect and relationship with their employees to get them aligned around their mission and their purpose. And it shows up in revenue growth. So glad you're with us today. Really looking forward to unpacking compliance. Welcome to Mission to Grow, the small business guide to cash, compliance, and the war for talent. I'm your host, Mike Vanoy. Each week, we'll bring you experts in accounting, finance, human resources, benefits, employment law, and more. You'll learn ways to access capital through creative financing and tax strategies, tactical information you need to stay compliant with ever-changing employment laws, and people strategies you need to win the war for talent. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Asure. Asure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. Enjoy the show. All right, so today we're talking about compliance. 5 questions in the SMB HR benchmark report. I'm going to rattle them off. I'm going to talk maybe some high-level summary, and then we're going to get into question by question. Do you train managers about HR laws like equal pay, overtime, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act? Do you keep a Form I-9 for each person you hire for 1 year or more? Do you have a documented process for handling HR investigations and inquiries? Do you conduct sexual harassment training? Are you certain you're compliant with wage and hour requirements to FLSA? It's a significant spread, 15% spread between fast growth companies and zero growth firms. But when I look at the under 25 employee firms, a smaller group, it's big. It's 25 percentage points. So this is yet another area where the fast growth firms, either they just get it, or they maybe small shrinking firms get it also, but they're not making it a priority. They don't have the resources. Something's going on that is a clear differentiator for the fast growth firms, that they're doing a much, much better job in the area of HR compliance. You guys all know my guest, the perfect guest for HR compliance, Mary Simmons. Welcome back, Mary.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. I'm curious, before we jump in question by question, what's your take when you saw the results? I'd say in aggregate, fast growth firms versus zero growth firms when it just comes to compliance in general.
So I think that compliance is an area where a lot of business owners are like, yeah, I know I need to be compliant. That's going to cost me too much money or take too much time. I'm going to roll the dice, so I'm fine. So again, I think sometimes the smaller business owner says, A, I don't have the bandwidth. B, I don't have the knowledge, right? And C, well, you're going to cost me a lot of money, Mary, if I'm going to put you in charge of compliance. But I would say again that we can't look at these sorts of things like it's just an outlay of money. First of all, it's an insurance in case you were audited. You know everything's in order. Why would you want to look over your shoulder all the time and go, "Oh, gee, I hope we don't get audited. I hope my things are in order. I hope they don't find what's not in order because I know I haven't done the right thing." But I would always also say, look, I don't want to leave this compliance section with fear. Like, the auditors are coming, Mike, be careful. This can also tie to ROI because when we do things correctly and give the correct benefits and work with employees correctly, and we'll go through it slowly, as you said, our employees are going to stay. So we're going to retain them. We're going to attract employees because they know this is an organization that does things right. Believe it or not, word of mouth gets out there very quickly. Some of the industries we work with are very small, so the pool of candidates is very small. And you've got sites, that have employees talk about employers, even if it's not a small, geographic, area that you're recruiting in. So business owners need to do the right thing, not just out of fear of being audited, but for the entirety of keeping and attracting talent.
This section. So of the 8 sections, just to remind our audience, recruiting and hiring. So we go from pre-employment to post-employment. Recruiting and hiring, benefits, onboarding, development, compliance, retention, performance, and post-employment. Those are the areas of the survey. So we're smack dab in the middle of the employee life cycle here. We're talking about compliance. Having been in this industry for a really long time, but also an entrepreneur in running businesses during that time, this is one of those things that's like, I think most business owners, small business owners especially, understand that they're not intentionally breaking laws. They probably have a sense that they're not compliant in areas, but they don't know where. But because they've never personally been sued yet, or fined yet, been audited yet, this kind of feels like driving 56 miles an hour in a 55 zone. It's like, yeah, it's illegal, but am I? What risk do I really have?
Right.
And so when I think of and we'll talk about a whole bunch of stuff, especially in these specific questions. But when I think about just the correlation, so what does an entrepreneur care about? Well, you care a heck of a lot about revenue. You care a heck of a lot about growing your business. And when you have 1,065 businesses respond to a survey, and if I look at the smaller firms, the less than 25 employees, and there's a 25 percentage point spread between fast growth companies who said yes 82% of the time to these 5 questions versus zero growth firms who said yes 57% of the time, 25% spread. It's just a massive correlation. So
Yeah.
you might not think about compliance being a revenue driver, and maybe it's not even causal, but it's a minimum a correlation that cannot be ignored because the data set is too big, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you do have to look at it in the negative. There are plenty of businesses who have gone out of business by doing these things wrong and having major lawsuits.
I almost liken this. Sometimes I hate and sometimes I love this metaphor. It's like my house is never caught on fire, but that doesn't mean I don't have insurance on my
That's
house.
insurance. Right.
In the bank, the mortgage company wouldn't allow you to because the risk is just too big, right? And I think that's how you really have to think about it, especially in a smaller business. On one hand, the smaller businesses, the data would say they are less compliant. They said yes less frequently than the broader population. They're the ones most vulnerable. A lawsuit or a big fine It's an existential threat, the same as your house. If it burns down, you don't have insurance. Existential threat. Like, what the
Right.
heck are you going to do, right? If you're a business with, let's say you got 15 employees and you're doing $2 million a year, and you're working on 5% margins, right? So you got $100,000 in profit coming in, and you get sued for $700,000, you're out of business,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I kind
Significant.
of hate the scare tactic angle, but the reality is you can't ignore part of compliance is risk mitigation, right?
Right. 100%. And it doesn't have to be costly. I think it can be done fairly quickly, and it doesn't have to be costly.
That's right. That's right. All right. Let's move on to the questions themselves. So the first question we asked in this category: do you train managers about HR laws like equal pay, overtime, Americans with Disabilities Act, etc.? Zero growth firms said yes 56% of the time. Fast growth firms said yes 81% of the time. So it's a 25% spread that grows to 30% spread for your smaller firms. So not a big surprise. Smaller, not it's maybe is surprising to some people that a simple thing like do you train your managers on HR stuff has a major correlation to revenue growth. Not a big surprise that the smaller firms struggle more.
Right.
What's your insight there?
I like to give you examples.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example. So I was on a call with a client the other day, and I was talking to them about the new changes in the Fair Labor Standards Act, the increase in the minimum salary. They were quite surprised, and this is in a state that it significantly impacts the business, right? So it's going from 35 and change, 35 and 5 and change, all the way up to 58,000 and change
Yeah.
by January of 25, which is kind of right around the corner, Mike. Um, and I said, well, talk to me about if we switch some of your salaried people who are at that 35 to non-exempt, will they get overtime? And she said, no, 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 we don't have overtime. And I go, you never, and it was a manufacturer. And I was like, wow, I've never had a manufacturer say that, when you have to create, extra widgets because you got a new contract, there tends to be overtime in manufacturing settings occasionally. No, no, we never have overtime. And I said, you don't? And she said, yeah, the managers control it. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I'm leading a long story short. How do they control it? She said, we just don't give it. If they end up working overtime, we'll give them comp. And this is the office manager. So the managers are doing it wrong, and the office managers doing it wrong because nobody trained them.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
experts in managing production. She's an expert in managing the office. They were never taught that you can't give comp time in this situation. There's very small exemptions, but you can't give comp time instead of giving overtime. And they've been doing it for years.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is one of those things that I give folks the benefit of the doubt. People are not breaking the laws on purpose and trying to squeeze people.
Agreed.
This is one of those areas that you could just have a good, just a human understanding. Oh, you know what? You worked 43 this week. We'll just keep it your normal 40 for on the paycheck. Just 37 next week. We'll even it out. So, and the employee might not feel infringed upon at all, but you
They might
can't.
like it.
They might like it, right? But that doesn't mean it's not illegal. And here's where people get in trouble. We're in this ridiculously tight labor market, right? And so maybe you've been doing this for 20, 30 years, and employee has been like family, and now you have somebody new, and because such a tight labor market, you'll take anybody, and all of a sudden that person that happens to, they're telling their spouse or their friend at dinner over the weekend, oh, you know what, they did this. And that other person says, that's illegal, right? And all of a
Right.
sudden, boom, they don't go to the Department of Labor, but they do talk to an attorney who absolutely pro bono says, I'll take that case. They
That's right.
call, all of a sudden there's a lawsuit in the Department of Labor. Guess what they do next? You're in
Class
an
action.
audit. you're in an audit that goes back years, and you're gonna pay a lot of money,
A lot of money.
even if none of your employees were upset by it.
Right. And if I'm going to speak to the other side, which is, retaining talent, most of your employees are going to prefer a little extra money in their paycheck than working less hours the next week and making less money the next week, right? Or getting comp time. So, if it doesn't resonate with people listening to do the right thing so you don't get audited, do it because it's a better way to retain staff, because that they deserve that overtime legally. But I think also most employees are going to say, yeah, I'd rather have a bigger paycheck than have a couple extra hours off next week.
And regardless, it's illegal. You can't do it. Right.
Right.
And there's a difference between not getting caught and being legal. And I think just like the house and the insurance, you may never have the fire, but God forbid that you don't have insurance if it happens, right? Because you might not be able to recover if it does. Right. So, and this is an area, it doesn't cost you a cent to stay compliant other than the time invested to actually learn what the laws are, right?
Right.
Anything else on training of managers? So you give an example of a policy that they were like intentionally doing it wrong without realizing it. Any other cases? Maybe it's ignorance of the law. Maybe it's they're teaching something that they think is the law and it's wrong.
Yeah, a lot of times we have another example where, the leave laws are very hard to keep up with. There's local, state, and federal leave laws. And nor should a manager be an expert in HR. Nobody expects that. When we do this training, we're teaching managers how to recognize when to escalate to HR where the experts can handle it. So there was an instance where there was, turnover of a very important individual. I wouldn't say high level, but it was this key person. And again, it happened to be manufacturing on the production line. They knew the machine. Nobody else knew the machine, etc.
Right.
So when, I asked if, we do the exit interviews a lot, and the individual said, well, I have to care for my mother and take her to all these, appointments. And my manager said I couldn't have more time off. I took all my vacation and all my sick days well, they were an FMLA eligible employer, Mike, and FMLA was never offered to the individual because the manager had no idea. They didn't even know what family medical leave was. So of course they couldn't say, go talk to HR. Maybe there's something that they can do. The individual just resigned. So at that point, of course, we said, well, would this work? We talked through FMLA and we kept this key person. So again, I want to just point out that, yes, this is insurance when you stay on top of compliance, but it also helps your HR function work the way it should, which is to attract and retain and manage your staff properly.
Yeah. Amen. Okay. We're going to get down into the weeds in the next question. It's much more tactical. Yeah. You keep Form I-9 for each person you hire and for 1 year after their employment ends. 84% of zero growth firms said yes. 86% of fast growth firms said yes. That's a 2% spread. What say you?
Maybe a little bit of that, but I would also say, and I think I've said it before, we do I-9 audits. I've done them in my career, and in 30 years, and I was just talking to this employer. I had one employer where I wasn't like, wow, there's so many mistakes. So maybe they have the I-9. Maybe they answered, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They answered this question right. But are those I-9s completed correctly? And when they say that everybody has an I-9, did they give it within the first 3 days of employment? Challenge. So that's a huge fine. And so is doing it properly. I mean, you can't imagine that if you fill in one spot wrong, Mike, it's like $1,000. One little area you filled in wrong, $1,000 fine.
You and I have done podcast episodes on this topic. I've done it with our
Yep.
friend Brian Schenker,
Yep.
Jackson Lewis. The form, if you just glance at it, it's not that complex looking.
No.
Uh, the challenge is the requirements on the employer are incredibly specific, from the timing to how it gets filled out in the storage. It's not complex. It's just so specific.
Correct.
Maybe just what recap for the folks who haven't seen that episode yet. We encourage you to go do so.
Yeah.
What are the big gotchas?
I think the 3-day requirement, I think one of the other things is when I did an audit once, I was looking at the forms and I said, why did everybody give a driver's license and a social security card? Like nobody gave you a passport. Nobody had a green card. Like, I'm so surprised. I said to the employer and they said, well, this is the offer letter. And we tell them that's what they have to bring. I said, no, no, no. There's a lot of options, right? So that can look like disparate impact. So
Explain that one. That might not be self-evident to everybody.
yeah. So, if you really look at an I-9, it comes with, I think it's up to 9 pages of instructions. When I send the I-9 to a new candidate or hand the I-9, we do it all electronically because we think it's a lot easier. We believe it's a lot easier. But if you want to do hard copies, you can do that. You give them the instructions and say, when you look at the form, it tells you, and the instructions, it tells you all the different types of identification that you can bring. And I always say it's kind of like a Chinese menu, right? So you can bring one thing from column A, and that would be something like a passport, or an item from B and an item from C. And that would be your driver's license and your social, but there's quite a few other options.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to give all of your candidates options of what they can bring in. You should not be telling them the only things that they should bring in. I would say some of the other errors that I see is that there is an employee section and then an employer section. Every single line has to be filled in. If it's not filled in, you can put NA for not applicable. And the employee must fill in their space. So if it looks like, you signed for the employee and you signed as the employer person who's completing the employer section, that would be bad too. So don't fill it in for the employees. They should be filling it in themselves.
Yeah. That example about the ID, I suspect the employer didn't even say you can only give us a driver's license. They probably just said, give us driver's license. Right?
Right.
That seemed perfectly reasonable. But
Right.
think about the other end of that. Well, you know what? I had a DUI. I didn't disclose that. I have reliable transportation to and from work every day. I can take the train, or I have a ride. Uh, it was embarrassing, so I didn't want to disclose that. I guess I can't work here. All of a sudden,
You
you know,
lost a candidate.
you lost a candidate, and they probably didn't report it because they didn't know better that their passport or a state ID would work just fine. But yeah, it's crazy how nitty gritty.
Yeah,
Anything else you want to say on I-9s? I feel like this is a black and white issue.
it is. Agreed.
I think maybe the question itself and how it correlates, because the first question we explored, do you train managers about HR laws like equal pay, overtime, ADA, etc.? A little more general. This one was super specific. I think we're not trying to trip anybody up here, but when I look at this, 84% of the zero growth firms said yes, 86% of fast growth firms said yes. We just know from experience, you give one example in 30 years of somebody that was actually true. People just don't know what they don't know, and
Correct.
that's what gets you around compliance. All
Correct.
right, our next question: do you have a documented process for handling HR investigations and inquiries? Pretty big spread here. Zero growth firms, 62% said yes. Fast growth firms, 84%. It gets to be a big spread when I look at smaller firms under 25 employees. 41 of small percent of zero growth, 76% of fast growth firms. What's interesting to me here as I look at this is it it dropped for both. Fast growth said the bigger population went from 84 to the smaller population 76, so dropped by 8 percentage points. Across the whole audience, it was from 62 to 41, so 21 percentage points. How I read into that is fast growth firms, smaller firms struggle with all this stuff, right? Because they're strapped for resources.
Right.
But the fast growth firms only dropped by 8 versus zero growth by 21.
Right.
So the fast growth firms, even in smaller companies, are still doing something right here around how they think about employees. Because do you have a documented process for handling HR investigations and inquiries? There actually is some legislation around this in California. We just did a show on this recently. But I'd say federally, there's not like some law you must have a process, but it's a good HR best practice that indicates how serious you take employee complaints, how serious you take employer relations, how serious you feel about your employees feeling safe and feeling heard, right? What's your explanation for why such a big gap on just the fact whether they do or don't have a documented process for handling investigations?
Well, and again, absolutely, of course, I'm an HR nerd. I believe all of those things. Your employees need to feel fully heard. But here's what I want to say to the business owners who are listening. If they don't have a process to follow, somebody to go to internally, and it can't be one person, it should be 2 or 3 people, your manager, your manager's manager, or the outsourced HR or the internal HR, right? Because one of those, if you only give one person, that person could be the abuser, or you might be embarrassed to go to, you know,
Sure.
a male or a female to talk about these things. Um, so if you don't have a policy like that and they don't know who to go to, they're going to an attorney, or they're going to the Department of Labor, or they're going to the EEOC. And you ought to listen, all of those entities are, yes, maybe want to do the right thing, but they want to monetize that situation. So if you don't have an internal process where you can do an investigation and the employee knows who to go to, they're going externally, and
Yeah.
it's going to cost you money. Whether or not that investigation finds that there was any fault, it's probably going to cost you money.
The aggrieved employee, they're going to go somewhere, probably going to start in their own household and talk to their partner or their spouse or significant other or their
Right.
friends.
Yeah.
And their friends are probably going to have a voice in what they do. And if they don't perceive there to be an outlet at work, okay, here's what I do when something like this comes up.
Yeah.
They're going to seek remedies somewhere, right? That's
A
really smart.
100%. And I would say, and you know, this is not truly self-fulfilling, but I do want to say that having an external person do the investigation and having outsourced HR is powerful, because we used to call it, and of course I was internal HR for 30 years, the walk of shame, right? Oh man, when you come out of the HR office, everybody's going, why'd you go to HR? Why'd you go? Did you get fired? What's going on? Right. So, it can be embarrassing, right? So when you have a outsourced HR, they can go into an office, they can call from home, and the investigation is done. And the appearance of the investigation is going to, obviously feel to the employee like it's impartial, right? So
Yeah.
if I have a complaint against you and you're best friends with Mary, the HR director, then I'm not going to feel really confident that Mary is going to listen to me because I'm complaining about her BFF, right? So
Right.
there's a lot to unpack there. This process has to be here to protect the organization as well as protecting the employee. It helps your culture. And I would say it ties back to productivity, because if they have no place to go,
Yeah.
everybody is talking about it. And the more they're standing at the water cooler, or the more they're getting, if you have a remote, the more time they're spending, on a Teams chat talking about, oh, did you hear?
Right.
The less
Right.
productive your staff is.
Right. This is just a win-win all the way around, right? So
It is.
if I'm the employee who feels aggrieved, and maybe I don't want to say feels aggrieved. I mean, maybe somebody was like literally making racially motivated jokes in the break room, and it's just offensive and wrong, right? So this doesn't have to be touchy feely, borderline gray area stuff. There's plenty of black and white. What people do sometimes are wrong, and sometimes the boss doesn't know about it. It just happened in the
Right.
break room, right? If
Right.
you don't give that employee the opportunity to voice their concern and share that, you made the case already. They'll go outside to an attorney and guarantee that's going to be expensive, or the EOC audit or something's going to be expensive. Not in a selfish way, but when you create the path internally, and whether it's outsourced HR, there's a whole bunch of really good reasons for that you just outlined. Or maybe you create more of a hotline where people don't have to have that walk of shame to the HR office internally, but you create that path. You give an opportunity to demonstrate how you're going to respond as a business and as a
Correct.
business owner. It's like, oh my gosh, Mary, I had no idea that so and so even thought things like that, let alone said those kind of jokes. I want you to know I'm going to take this super serious. I'm going to investigate this thoroughly, blah, 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 blah. Right. And just the opportunity to demonstrate genuine empathy
Correct.
was
Even
so
if you think it's ridiculous. And this is part of the management training, right? You want to make sure that managers
right.
take it seriously, escalate it to HR right away. And of course we do this training, and they understand that if the employee goes, no, 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 don't tell anybody, they are obligated to, escalate it. And I'll just add one more thing on the compliance side, which is that the EEO has not uh, changed their policy significantly in over 20 years. And they just redefined some of the areas within the equal employment opportunity policies that everyone should have in their handbook. And one of the areas I would say that they picked up on, which I'm thankful for, is virtual harassment. We all knew it could happen. It was always protected, but when they define it, those lawsuits will have more teeth to them.
Right.
And it happens, right? So that's just something that I want to make sure our listeners understand. They need to update their handbooks with that policy, and probably give additional training to managers.
Yeah. That question kind of, I think, goes hand in glove with the next one. So that's having a documented process for the investigations. And I almost regret a word we added here in this question is, do you conduct sexual harassment training? The question probably should have read anti-harassment training, because it's not just harassment is harassment, and,
Correct.
it's illegal, whether it's based on gender, sexual identity, race, religion. There's lots of reasons that are illegal for harassment. Let's unpack the numbers. It's a 17% spread across the broader population. It's a
Mhm.
33% spread across smaller companies. So once again, it's clear of all these categories we've been talking about in this series. There's almost always a bigger spread with smaller firms, because they don't have the time resources to do these HR best practices. I
Yeah.
think the gap is biggest between the broader population and the small firms around compliance. 33% spread. So I'm going to say just those numbers. 42% of zero growth firms said yes, they conduct sexual harassment training. 42%, less than half. 75% of fast growth firms said that they do. Um, this is one of those things. Now it's mandated in several states. I'd be curious to cut the data to see how that falls. Again, what's you and your team talk to clients every single day of all sizes.
Yeah.
What do you see when it comes to sexual harassment, maybe more specifically anti-harassment?
Right. So sexual harassment obviously is discrimination, or maybe not obvious, but it's discrimination based on sex. And that falls into a lot of different categories, right? It doesn't just mean male against female. It could be female to male. I can sexually harass you as well as you can me. It's also, harassment against pregnant women. It's also, transgender and the LGBT community. So, you know, sexual harassment, goes across the board. But, even though it does say anti sexual harassment training in 6+ states is, mandated to do that training, every time we do it, obviously, we talk about all of the protected categories
Yeah.
and how discrimination against protected categories for race or color or religion is also against the law. But I'll say this: um, for those states that are not mandated to do this training, yes, I have a difficult time having those employers get on board. And remember, if individuals listen to our last podcast about development, it can be very inexpensive to do
Right.
e-training on these topics, right?
Right.
So there's really no excuse not to do it.
Yeah.
So it needs to be done whether it's mandated or not, because it's against the law to discriminate, either sexual harassment or other, in every single state. And as we talked about in the development section, when you do training, it is positive for your culture, and positive for your culture leads back to ROI because it's going to
That's
make people
you're
more.
you're you're reading in my mind. That's exactly where I was going. I mean, this is one of those things. Like you're right, 6+ states that it is legally mandated. You must do it. But man, I just feel like this is one of those things. So again, I keep thinking, okay, this is the compliance question. What is it about following a law that correlates to revenue growth? And I think the basis of an employer-employee relationship is trust and respect, right? And if you if you're providing anti-harassment, anti-sexual harassment training in a non-mandated state, what is it that you're telling your employees?
Yeah.
You're telling your employees that you respect them, you trust them, you want to have a safe working environment for everybody, regardless of how you view the world, right? And I'm going to help bring people along who might not see it the same way as me, and I'm going to protect those people from those folks who don't see it that way, and I'm going to establish clear rules of the road for my organization so that we can all rally together around the mission of the business, right?
Right. And not be distracted by, feeling uncomfortable, etc. So
Yeah.
100%, it leads to ROI.
Yeah, no question. All right, let's take our last one. This is an interesting one. We could go deep here. I'm just going to start out by saying there's just no way businesses could possibly know all the nuance to the Fair Labor Standards Act. It is so big, it is so complex. We asked the question: are you certain you are compliant with wage and hour requirements according to the FLSA? 84% of zero growth firms said yes. 92% of fast growth firms said yes. So it's not just that it's a small spread of 8%. There's
Right.
not a huge correlation.
Right.
Everybody is very confident that they are. What say you, Mary Simmons?
Well, I'll tell you a secret, and I'm not embarrassed to say that after 30+ years working with attorneys, having an assurance certification, I would tell you that I don't even know every single thing there is to know about FLSA because it can be very specific. There's always something that trips you up. So, what does FLSA do, right? The name kind of tells you Fair Labor Standards Act. What they were trying to do is set a standard. So, what don't they do? They don't tell you that you have to take vacation, that you have to give vacation. What they So they don't go that route. What they say is how you pay your employees. That's why it's named wage and hour, right? That's kind of the layman term for it. So how do you pay your employees? What breaks do they have to have? Now, don't forget, you're going to have state and then local law layered on top of FLSA. Your employees get the best of those laws. So in our states, and listen, it's not, everybody just thinks it's New York on one coast and California on the other coast, and every other area is, fine and there's no laws. Not true.
Yeah.
Massachusetts, Colorado,
Yeah.
Hawaii, their Department of Labor's and many other states, Washington State, will have other laws that govern how we pay our employees. The overtime, right? So a couple of states, it's not just California, have a nuance to the overtime. Travel pay, right? And a lot of employers go, what? And I'm like, well, if you have an employee go to a client or travel to another one of your stores or, restaurants, etc., what happens then? What happens if they have to fly someplace? How do you pay them? There are so many nuances here that I challenge the affirmative. I like the energy and I like the positivity, but I
Yeah.
will challenge because as an HR professional, this is quicksand. And I study this. I probably read an article. I read an article every day on HR, but wage and hour at least twice a week will be the topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a lot to it.
Is it safe to say that most small business leaders, owners, or managers, when they think wage and hour, they think minimum wage, they think overtime, they think
I'd say
maybe
so.
maybe they think travel pay and do I have to pay breaks? It probably doesn't go a lot deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And probably the biggest area where I find the confusion is you do not have a choice, people. All of your employees are exempt or non-exempt. There's no in between. You don't make that decision. The employee doesn't make that decision. It's a duties test. And that's what drives the exemption. So, I was on a call with an employer trying to help them with the changes in FLSA, and they had no idea what exempt or non exempt meant. They're like, I just pay them all salary. That's what they want. It's easier for them. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, do you have an hour?
Mhm.
That's what it takes
Yeah. Right.
to walk
Right.
through this.
Yeah. There's no such thing as they're a salaried employee or an hourly employee. They're exempt or they're non-exempt, and the law is very specific what qualifies for both of those categories. You don't get to choose; you just have to follow the law. And
Right.
I think, I mean, fair to say, you walk into businesses and people get that one wrong almost every day.
Almost every day, even HR professionals, right? If we're working with an HR professional, and I've been there, sometimes, when you're internal, it's hard to get out of the weeds and you're like, but that position's always been exempt, right? So you can't get on the balcony and kind of look at it objectively. And we'll be like, all right, let's walk through this. Do they do this? Do they do that? You have to have a good job description to go with that. So that's where that HR function, you need a function to make that, you know, to hit all of these laws correctly.
We've been working together too long, Mary, because that's exactly where I was going to go. So, topic number one, episode number one in this series, recruiting and hiring. Question number one in that section: do you have written job descriptions for each opening? So here we are midway through the series, and we're talking about the topic of compliance. Are you certain you're compliant with wage and hour? It goes back to your job description. And are you writing the job descriptions in such a way, like maybe the business, maybe because of the way your P&L works, the way you're monetize this industry or you're offering, maybe you need it to be quote unquote hourly or you need it to be salary.
Yeah.
You don't get to decide after you've hired them what you put them on. You need to write the job description that backs into the FLSA requirements, right?
Correct.
So these
Correct.
things are circular. It's like we understand and respect. Maybe you need to level out your expenses to make expense forecasting easier. So you need people on salary. Okay, but that means you got to write the job descriptions right in the first place. You got to hire those. You got to manage performance accordingly. This is all hyperlinked to each
All
other.
related. Yeah, I love that hyperlink.
I'm gonna give you the last word. Here's my recap. 57%, and I'm going to focus on the small businesses because I think it's clear they're the folks who struggle the most with compliance. The data is really clear on this. 57% of zero growth firms said yes to all 5 questions we just reviewed. 82% of fast growth firms said yes to all 5 questions for under 25 employees. 25 percentage point swing on something that I think most businesses would not correlate to revenue growth. They think of, okay, there's the administrative side of HR, which is following the laws, and it's the boring stuff. And okay, I got to do it, but if I don't do it, am I really going to get caught? I'll run that risk. And then there's the soft stuff of HR, which is finding talent, recruiting them, bringing on board, developing them, retaining them. And this is just crystal clear. They are completely intertwined.
Yeah.
The companies who take compliance serious, it's part of the employee management function. It's part of the employee relationship. It's part of trust and respect between you and your employees. And the correlation is massive, a 25% difference from fast growth to zero growth firms for revenue growth around compliance. Mary, you get the final word.
Agreed. I would say that compliance is not an option. So there are areas where we have to follow compliance. And I've had business owners say, okay, what's the over under? I'm like, what? They're like, okay, if I get sued for this, what's it going to cost me? I'll take the chance. That's not the only reason to follow compliance, is not so that you don't get caught in an audit. I want everybody to see the correlation to, being compliant makes for happier employees, right? It helps retain them, because there could be a, inexpensive, option, or a absolutely free option, like offering family medical leave does not cost an employer anything. Yes, that person's not going to be there, but it beats them resigning, right? So look at it as though when we follow compliance, that it is an employee experience to help them be more productive for your organization and to protect your organization. So it's both.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Mary, love talking through these topics with you. I think we have 3 left here. Next, we're going to talk retention, performance, and then finally post-employment. We'll wrap this series up. Spoiler alert, our next one has the biggest impact between zero growth and fast growth firms of any other category in the survey, and that's retention. You're going to want to stick around for that one. So until next week, thanks for joining me again, Mary.
Thanks, Mike.
And for everybody else, thanks for letting us be part of your mission to grow. That's it for this episode of Mission to Grow. Thanks for joining us today. For show notes and more episodes, visit us at missiontogrow.com. If you found this content valuable, I invite you to share it with a friend and subscribe to the show. If you really want to help, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Asure. Asure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. To learn more about how Asure can help your business grow, visit AsureSoftware.com. Until next time.